Motivation for the El Paso gunman poses questions for the White House. What Trump says to fire up his base, even on visits like this to El Paso a couple of months ago, often treads a fine line. The Democrats running to replace him say it goes too far.
It's also recognized that under this administration and this president, there has been a failure to actually call these crimes what they are, which is domestic terrorism. Instead of inciting fear all the time about the other, this president should acknowledge that we also have a lot of terrorism that is occurring within our own country.
The last president has added his voice in a statement, Barack Obama saying we should soundly reject the language coming out of the mouths of any of our leaders that feeds a climate of fear and hatred or normalizes racist sentiments. Leaders who demonize those who don't look like us or suggest that other people, including immigrants, threaten our way of life or refer to other people as subhuman or imply that America belongs to just one certain type of people. Recent history in places like Charlottesville backs up what researchers say, that hate crime groups across America are on the rise. In a synagogue in Pittsburgh and now in El Paso, the hate speech has turned into deadly action. Some Republicans say the president is simply reflecting the mood of the country.
There's an angst in this country, and the angst in this country is really focused on a mistrust and a lack of things happening in Washington. And I think President Trump has tapped into that for a number of years, and I think the immigration issue is a centerpiece of that in terms of a lack of resolution. So I think when he has simple solutions, things like the wall, I think people jump onto that.
The El Paso gunman used the same web forum as the killer in the Christchurch massacre in New Zealand, a site seen by many as a breeding ground for extremism. It's now been dropped by its cybersecurity firm. It is likely it will reappear. In addressing the nation, Donald Trump did call out the scourge of extremism.
We must recognize that the internet has provided a dangerous avenue to radicalize, disturb minds, and perform demented acts. We must shine light on the dark recesses of the internet and stop mass murders before they start.
But his words have been blamed for at least raising the temperature of hatred that's boiled to the surface with deadly consequences. Greg Milam, Sky News, El Paso.
Well, let's talk more about this now with Eleanor Penny, editor at Navarro Media, and Dr. Stuart Wayton, a criminologist at Abertay University. Emma, to you first of all, doesn't politics reflect the tone of the population, not the other way around? Hi, Eleanor, can you hear me? Mm-hmm. Hi, Eleanor. I was just asking you whether or not you think a lot of people would say that politics reflects the population rather than the other way around.
Well, what's clear is that Donald Trump has, of course, tapped into sentiments of despair and sentiments of outrage in the American population. But, of course, what he's done is inflamed those tensions into a mandate for racial hatred. Now, of course, the person responsible for these devastating acts was the shooter involved. However, the messages coming out of the White House, the messages coming out of the Trump administration have given the message to people who are filled with hate, people who are prepared to take their white supremacist beliefs and turn them into violent actions, that they are on the side of history, that they are on the side of the good. Now, that's exactly the sentiments that we should be holding our politicians to account for. And the language that blames these kinds of attacks on fringe spheres of the internet or on mental health issues really misses a trick, because the roots of white supremacy and the roots of attacks like this, which have been flourishing throughout the previous few years, go deep into our society and indeed right to the top of power.
Dr. Stuart Wayton from Abertay University, you're a criminologist. I mean, in his piece there, Greg Milam talks about Trump's words raising the temperature. And from what Eleanor says, do you not think there is a case that by leaders using phrases such as "go back to where you came from," that it does raise the temperature and, as she says, make some people who want to commit crimes feel that they are on the side of the good?
Well, you can make that argument. I think, as Eleanor says there, I think you've always got to be careful not to try and just directly make a link between a political speech and a lunatic or a profoundly violent, disturbed person butchering people in a cafe. I think one of the things that's missing in the discussion, however, is a different way of thinking about the race issue. Because I think what's happening in society at the minute, to some extent, is that society's being racialized. So rather than having, if you like, the old-fashioned type of racist outlook, we have a kind of form of separatism, which is actually quite mainstream. Yeah, so we get a discussion about cultural identity, my culture, black culture, gay culture, different cultures and identities that are almost celebrated. This idea that you have your separate, different identity. And if you actually read what this guy said in El Paso, he seems to be part of that. He seems to have a sense of himself as he has a white identity. And he wants the white identity to be separate from these other identities. And we need to live separately, and feels that his identity is under siege. It's very similar arguments to the discussion about things like cultural appropriation, where people like Elna perhaps, denounce whiteness or denounce people who are culturally appropriate and elevate this sense of identity and separateness, which are perhaps can help explain more the underlying cultural kind of fragmentary tendencies we seem to have today, and the kind of levels of angst and anxiety and sense of being under siege that seems to exist within these self-defined cultural groups.
Let's put that to Alan. What do you think about that, Alan? Do you think we are all, generally becoming more separatist, becoming more individual, and believing that whatever community it is that we belong to is somehow superior?
I mean, this is precisely the problem, right? To equivocate between different groups using the language of identity on one hand to describe their own experience, to form collective bonds of support and celebration, and on the other hand, people using the language of identity as a creed of hatred and a creed of violence. We cannot afford to pretend that those are equal doctrines, right? This is precisely the language that Donald Trump himself was using after the rally at Charlottesville, saying that there were very fine people on both sides, referring on one hand to neo-Nazis and on the other hand to those opposing them. We cannot afford to capitulate to this, quite frankly, lazy language that completely fails to hold people in power to account and to identify where violence is coming from, who is perpetrating it, and who it is directed towards. And that is exactly the kind of thing that we have to do if we want to stop these attacks from happening again and ensure that everyone in our society has a basic right to dignity and to safety.
I mean, Stuart, do you not think that, what Eleanor is saying about the fact that we can be separate, we can celebrate different elements of the communities that we belong to or whatever, but that it is up to the leaders to not escalate and to not increase the temperature of those divisions?
Well, I agree. I think the thing is, again, I think there's a confusion with Trump. I think Trump is represented again as a kind of a white supremacist, old-fashioned racist. But again, I think that's not really right. I think it's more that he plays to a sense of white victimhood. But I think that's again part of the kind of the cultural identity politics, is this portrayal of victimhood. I mean, if I can just put back to Elna, this is a quote from her that I just found. It says, "I guess it's uncomfortable for white middle-class, well-spoken and sharply dressed people to recognise that throughout history most fascists have looked and sound a lot like them, directly seeming to equate fascism with being white and middle-class." So, when Elna says this hatred on one side and not from another, I'm not sure that's true. There seems to be a lot of denunciation of whiteness and this kind of this idea of a kind of white privilege, which is sort of spat at people, the deplorables, I suppose, as Hillary Clinton said. So I think on all sides, cultural separation can be problematic and can lead to tension. And I think that's probably what we're seeing here.
I mean, Eleanor, it is fair enough to say, isn't it, that the far left are in no way innocent here, that there's just as much bile and there's just as much violence in words from the far left as there is from the far right.
I mean, I think that's a rather extraordinary statement, given that far left terrorism is basically non-existent across the world, and that far right terrorism has claimed many dozens of lives. And
what
being rude is one thing, but advocating actual genocide is another.
What about anti-Semitism in the Labour Party? There are a lot of people who are Labour Party members who feel that the very far left of the Labour Party have led to it being a less tolerant place. That's just one example.
Well, I mean, we absolutely need to recognise that anti-Semitism is deeply woven into the fabric of our society, and you can see that in the manifestos of the far-right shooters that have been in recent years, from Christchurch to, of course, the Tree of Life synagogue shooting. The anti-migrant sentiment and anti-Semitism are in fact deeply bound up together and deeply linked to this sense of white victimhood, the idea that white society is somehow under siege from an invasion of othered people. It's the language that Trump has been reflecting. It's the language that's been increasingly popularised across our society in recent years. And to really tackle anti-Semitism, we need to not pretend that this is a particular proclivity of one particular sector of society, whether on the left or the right, but recognise that its roots go deep and that we are all responsible for routing it out of ourselves, our communities, and of our nations as a whole.
OK, really interesting debate. Eleanor Penny from Navarro Media and Dr. Stuart Waiton, criminologist at Abertay University. Thank you both very much for joining us.
Thank you.
This is Sky News Today. Coming up, we're going to have the latest from Heathrow as talks continue to stop strikes.
Let's talk about hopes and dreams, but don't give me cliches. Give me something more, something outrageous. It took Leicester 2 seasons back in the Premier League to win a title. Why not do it in your first?
Norwich are champions.
Hey David, you want to be the first goalkeeper to keep 38 clean sheets? Now we're talking. And Frank, you'll never win anything with kids, right? Liverpool, they just want to go one better.
Let the drama begin.
New season, new dreams. To upgrade for the Premier League, go to sky.com/sports.
I chose British Seniors because I wanted to find an easy way to leave some money for my children.
I chose British Seniors because I didn't want my family to have to worry about paying for my funeral.
I chose British Seniors because they're flexible. It's free to apply to increase or decrease my monthly premiums to suit my needs.
Every year, British Seniors welcome more customers who choose our over-50s life insurance as a simple and convenient way to leave some money for their loved ones when they die.
With British Seniors, I can apply to add my partner to my policy.